It's incredible how far scientific research has moved us all closer to cures for cancer by harnessing the power of our immune system. Making discoveries in a laboratory is only the start of a long road to getting to patients. Before any treatment becomes part of the standard of care, it must go through rigorous testing to determine its safety and effectiveness in human patients. And that's where clinical trials come in. And we're going to learn about those right now. Here with us to explain what clinical trials are and why patients should explore them is Dr. Peter Fecci, who is a neurosurgeon, scientist, and director of the Duke Brain Tumor Immunotherapy Program at the Duke Cancer Center in Durham, North Carolina. Dr. Fecci is dedicated to providing patients with brain cancer access to the latest in cancer care, including immunotherapy. He's here to tell us what clinical trials are and what patients need to know when considering a trial. Dr. Fecci, thanks for joining us, and we're ready to learn about clinical trials.
Thank you, Tamron, so much for the introduction. And I'd like to welcome all of you here in our virtual audience to this discussion of clinical trials. What are clinical trials? We have to begin with a definition. And most simply put, clinical trials are studies or research that involve humans as the subjects. This is easily contrasted from preclinical studies, which are those studies leading up to clinical trials that involve often animal subjects, for instance. And they are really designed, clinical trials that is, to answer very specific questions about either a new treatment that's yet to be tested or a new question about a currently existing treatment or intervention, one that hadn't been addressed before. The ultimate aim is to improve treatments and to design new treatments that improve the quality of life for people with diseases. Before we can really have an involved discussion on clinical trials, it's probably useful to define some of the terms that you'll frequently hear in these discussions. A lot of the terms here describe clinical trials and their nature. First term is prospective. You'll often hear people saying that the proper way to conduct a clinical trial is as a prospective, randomized, controlled study. So, what does prospective mean? Prospective means that from the time of the initiation moving forward, we decide to study an intervention, and from here, at this point forward, we're going to study the effects of that intervention on someone as their circumstances change. Retrospective studies, by contrast, means that the intervention has already occurred and perhaps wasn't one that we knew we had planned to study, but we look backwards to see what effect it had after the fact. The advantage of a prospective study is that we can limit or address certain variables because we know that we plan to study the effects of a drug. Whereas in a retrospective study, we didn't have that freedom or luxury afforded us, and so we oftentimes can't control those variables as we look back at an intervention. Arms of a study are really just the groups themselves, i.e., whether or not you're receiving the red pill or the blue pill. A controlled study means that it's one that contains a control group. And what is a control group? A control group is a typical group or a group that is exposed to a typical or usual condition. And we use that group as a comparator so that we can study how different a particular intervention is in the experimental group, which is that group that looks at that particular special intervention, or to a group exposed to a special condition. Randomized. We want to make sure that the various arms of a study contain people that are fairly similar in nature. And the best way to achieve that is to randomly put people into groups so that as those groups are large, over time they start to look more and more alike, so that we don't have something like age or other factors playing a large role in determining the impact of an intervention on one particular group. Blinded is just what it sounds like. Oftentimes, it behooves us to have either the patients or the physicians or both be unaware of what intervention the patient is receiving. A single blinded study means oftentimes that it's the patient that doesn't know. A double blinded study means that neither the patient nor the investigator knows very frequently. What are clinical trial phases? You'll frequently hear people discussing phase one versus phase two versus phase three studies. Phase one studies are the early phase of the trial. These are usually the first studies conducted and are usually small studies designed to determine whether or not an intervention is safe. They're not really trying to figure out whether it works, but they might be escalating the dose of a study in various groups to figure out what's the maximum tolerated dose of that drug. Phase two is a larger study, and this is where we start to decipher whether or not the drug works. There are various endpoints that we're hoping to hit with that drug or intervention, and the phase two study determines how effective that drug is in hitting those endpoints. Phase three studies are the last part before we try to garner FDA approval, and this is where we do a very large study, often involving thousands of patients and potentially multiple institutions and even countries, where we're looking to see whether a particular drug works better than another drug that we understand or has been used previously. Usually, again, these are the largest studies and the last component before a drug is approved to hit the markets. Most simply put, as we move from phase one to phase two to phase three, I think it's helpful to think of these phases as measuring toxicity, efficacy, or a comparison. The ultimate goal, of course, is to find a successful drug or intervention and to garner an FDA approval so that drug becomes available to the larger public. Currently, there are dozens and dozens of drugs that have received FDA approval for cancer in a variety of cancer types. And here in this diagram, you can see multiple different cancers, and the number in the red circle indicates the number of current FDA approvals of cancer therapies. It's also useful for us to dispel some of the myths that we often hear about clinical trials. And these myths come out of, I think, fairly reasonable fears. Oftentimes, clinical trials are testing an intervention that hasn't been proven. And yet, we're often excited about those interventions because they frequently represent the latest and greatest or cutting edge therapies that physicians and patients are excited about. But with that excitement does come some trepidation. Some of the myths we frequently hear are I might only get the placebo or the sugar pill instead of the treatment. And while placebos are out there and still get used, they are used less and less commonly and never given in the absence of some other form of treatment. In other words, people will receive standard of care, but may receive a placebo on top of that, and that may be compared to the experimental intervention itself. But again, used less and less frequently. Trials are only for people who have run out of treatment options, i.e., a last resort. This is simply not true. Clinical trials right now are accessible to people with all stages of cancer and all types of cancer. And many of the interventions being tested are being tested upfront upon the diagnosis of cancer. So it's simply not true that these are only for folks that have failed standard of care. An additional myth is the following: I need to travel to a large hospital or cancer center to participate in a clinical trial. While it's certainly true that large centers often have a larger variety of clinical trials available to patients, the fact is that trials take place at local hospitals, cancer centers, doctors' offices, and really in all parts of the country, whether urban or rural. Another myth: my health insurance won't cover the cost of care in a clinical trial. The standard components of care in clinical trials are frequently covered by insurance, and the particular experimental intervention is often being covered cost wise by either the pharmaceutical company that's developed it, or the device company, or by an institution that is putting on the trial itself. So, frankly, very often, the clinical trials cost patients nothing additional over what standard of care would cost. Signing a consent form locks me into staying in the trial. Also, not true. In fact, there are typically tremendous amounts of protection afforded individuals on a clinical trial, and the consent itself offers usually very specific instructions about how to leave a clinical trial if one wants to be off of the study. You are free to change your mind for any reason about participating in a trial anytime before or during a clinical trial. I'll be made to feel like a guinea pig in an experiment. The overwhelming majority of trial participants say that they were treated with dignity and respect and report having had a positive experience on trial. Oftentimes, folks on clinical trials are receiving a lot of additional attention because a lot of oversight of these studies. And with that comes a lot of appreciation on the behalf of investigators, as well as an overwhelming degree of safeguards against anything that might go wrong in a clinical study. Part and parcel with that is the myth that clinical trials aren't safe. Again, tremendous amounts of oversight because we're testing experimental therapies in these studies. multiple safeguards coming from a variety of arenas, including an institutional review board at the institution conducting the study who has to approve and oversee that, the data and safety monitoring board typically affiliated with this, and a variety of ongoing protections that, as we see in a moment, will be included as part of the informed consent for a study. I think it's important to note, of course, here that essentially all drugs that you are familiar with currently at some point have gone through clinical trials prior to obtaining FDA approval. This highlights that even some of the things most famous out there now have gone through this process and should make people feel comfortable knowing that all drugs have to go through this. Clinical trials truly are crucial to advancing cancer medicine. When you look at some of the studies listed here on the left, Keynote 158, Keynote 522, these are some of the studies that you'll recognize the drugs being tested as some of those you see on commercials and frequently being standard of care in metastatic cancers today. All of those drugs and all those advances have come through clinical trials, and this is really an essential part to us developing the types of medications that change the landscape of cancer today. We do want to address the notion of informed consent. Informed consent documents to be on clinical trials can often be quite long and quite complex, and longer than the standard medical consents one might fill out to undergo even a procedure like a surgery. That can be a little bit daunting as you go through that, but you must be informed in what you're signing before signing it. So be bold in asking for details. It's your treatment plan. Ask questions if you have them, and make sure you're comfortable with the answers before moving ahead. You will never be forced to be a patient or a participant in a clinical trial, and your care can never be different should you decline or should you leave after joining. Informed consents that you sign will have all the elements you see listed below. Each of these will often be a bolded or highlighted section within that consent, and you should look for each of these elements to make sure that they're there. But I can assure you that they are, because nearly every informed consent has to have all of these sections listed below. Oftentimes, the question is, how can I find a clinical trial? There are so many ways to understand what trials are out there and what they involve. One of the easiest ways is to search online. ClinicalTrials.gov is a site that contains all clinical trials out there for nearly every disease, including all the forms of cancer. Every study that's open has to be registered with the government and is contained on this site. Obviously, you can ask your doctor or patients that you know that have had similar conditions. There are also advocacy organizations, not the least of which is the CRI Clinical Trial Finder here, whose phone number you can see on this slide, 1-855-216-0127. And there are a variety of other patient advocacy organizations out there as well. The simple fact is that it is oftentimes quite easy to find what clinical trials are available across the country, as well as to help someone find what one might be right for you. With that, this concludes the current talk on clinical trials. I hope that this was informative for all of you that are out here listening. I also would like to open this up to questions and hopefully can provide some useful answers as you search out what clinical trials might be right for you or a loved one.
Dr. Fecci, thank you so much for that presentation on clinical trials and for stressing not only how they're beneficial for cancer patients, but they're also helping to advance the field of immunology, advancing immunotherapies for more patients. And that's how we're going to achieve our vision of a world immune to cancer. So, of course, can't do it without the patients and can't do it without the companies running those trials. And also, thank you for pointing out the clinical trial online services. And I'll just remind folks, as you did, our clinical trial finder service also will match you with a navigator who can help you connect to potential immunotherapy trials that are right for you. So be sure to schedule your free and confidential one-on-one consultation right now. All right, with that, we have some questions, Dr. Fecci, from those watching. Please submit your questions in the Q&A as we go along. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. So we'll start right off the bat here with, does my doctor have to tell me or make a referral for me to go to a trial, or can I look on my own?
No, you can absolutely look on your own. And I think, frankly, An informed patient who's taking some of their care into their own hands is often those are often some of our best patients. And you may need a referral from your physician to the particular institution where that trial is being conducted. Or sometimes you can make an appointment there on your own. But in general, it does not require a referral.
Excellent. You used the phrase best patients. And I think I know what you mean by that. These are the patients that survive. And in the past, as we've had conversations about clinical trials, we've heard that those patients who go from trial to trial to trial are the ones who are on stages like this or platforms like this, sharing their stories of survival with immunotherapy. Can you say a little bit more about kind of I mean, everyone's cancer journey is different and the way everyone deals with it is different. But in your view, in your experience, what is that best patient? What does it look like?
Well, it's hard. I want to be clear that a lot of these drugs and trials are unproven, and being on a trial is not a guarantee of extended survival or a cure. But I will say on the flip side that a lot of the people that I see out there that are long-term survivors, even from cancers that are almost uniformly lethal, are folks who are on some of these experimental therapies. And I can think of people with, for instance, glioblastoma that are 16 years out after having received a variety of immunotherapies on study. But of course, others don't have some of that same success. But I think with experimental therapies, with cutting edge therapies, comes hope, new hope for being involved in something that's that next mode of treatment. And I think when I talk about best patients, and I think informed patients are the ones who are actively involved in their care, and they're often the ones that are therefore being most adherent to regimens. They're the ones that are showing up to the doctor's office. They never miss a dose, et cetera, et cetera. And that's often that right side of that survival curve, even if you're not on experimental therapy. So I think cancer is one of those things that always pays to take it head on, and the more aggressive you are, oftentimes the better you do.
So it's important then for patients to understand, and I think you articulated this very well about the kind of onboarding process when you're going into a trial, to understand that you as a patient are also committing to that regimen, committing to making those appointments, and committing to be a full and active partner in that study for as long as you want. As you also pointed out, these patients are volunteers. And so they're not forced to stay in a study if for whatever reason they no longer wish to be in one, and nor will they be penalized. So I'm glad you brought that up. We have a question from one of our registrants. What's the length of time someone is generally on a clinical trial? And can I stay on a trial longer if the treatment is working?
Good question. The answer to that is somewhat variable. It really depends on the study itself, right? So some studies, and every study that's conducted has a different set of endpoints. That might mean that the study ends when that endpoint is reached. And depending on what those endpoints are, can really determine the length of the study. Some studies might only be months, some might be years. Some might continue on a drug for as long as it remains effective. Others might say that they're only going to investigate that drug for a specific period of time. And if they're only investigating the drug for a specific period of time, it would be difficult to get that drug unless it's FDA approved, either during or after that process, or if it was a drug that had already been approved and you were simply studying a new use of that drug. In those instances, it would be easy oftentimes to stay on that medication. But the cheap answer here, unfortunately, is that the answer to that question really is highly variable, and it can really run the gamut.
Thanks for that. Another question. I have a very rare type of cancer, and it's difficult finding immunotherapy clinical trials. Is there a role for immunotherapy for patients with rare cancers? And how? And also, this wasn't the question from the patient, but then how are clinical trials helping to address rare cancer treatments with immunotherapy?
Yeah, that's a tough one because oftentimes, if we're going to study whether a drug is effective, we need a population of patients, and often a large population of patients to test that efficacy. Otherwise, we can't statistically determine how well it's working, and that makes rare cancers or any rare disease a little bit tougher to study. So what you'll often find is that there may not be a clinical trial specifically geared towards that rare cancer, but there may be a variety of trials out there that are a bit more agnostic to the type of cancer they're treating, and might only say something like solid tumors or hematologic malignancies. And so if you're talking about a rare solid tumor, for instance, there may be a variety of studies out there that are actually looking at any solid tumor and delivering a therapeutic intervention like an immunotherapy. And I would encourage you with a rare cancer to look for those types of studies.
That's very good advice. A lot of people are caught in that rare cancer category, so it's good to remind folks that there are those broader categories uh, uh, of any kind of tumor if it meets certain criteria. Here's a question from one of our registrants. I've had tumor genome testing. Can this hurt or will this help my chance of getting into immunotherapy clinical trials?
That's going to be a very study specific question. Certain studies will only want to, for instance, test a therapy against a cancer with a particular type of mutation. And so your sequencing might determine that you're indeed eligible for that study if you have a particular molecular marker or mutation, for instance, or it may determine that you're not eligible for that study on the other side of that coin. But having it done per se won't limit you. It'll only really be relevant if it's something that's helping to determine whether your cancer fits the bill for a particular trial.
Is there any reason why someone wouldn't want their tumors to be tested in this way? In other breakout sessions, it seems to be a good idea to have those tests done.
I think, for better or for worse, it's always, in my mind, better to have more information about your cancer. And I think at most large academic institutions, like the one I work at, it is a standard of care now to sequence somebody's tumor when it comes out. And we do that for all patients routinely. And it's now such a normal thing that it's usually covered by insurance as well.
Hmm, excellent. Here's a question, and this is a topic that's increasingly on everyone's agendas and minds. What efforts are being made to increase the numbers of people of color in clinical trials? And
Great question.
let's talk briefly, yeah, about the issue, and then what you know is being done about that.
Yeah, I think, we talked in the clinical trials presentation about, the notion that trials may be concentrated in certain types of institutions or certain areas. And so some of those things can create biases for the particular areas or regions where those trials may be being conducted. There's certainly not an intention to exclude certain groups, minorities, et cetera. But we also recognize when we look at data that the fact is that there does tend to be uh, discordances in who has access to these studies. And as a result, more and more when you apply to begin a clinical trial as an institution or a researcher, et cetera, one of the things that you have to assure your institutional review board is that every effort will be made to make sure the trial is available equally to people of all socioeconomic backgrounds, to people of all ethnic backgrounds, people of all races. And you have to actually provide specific examples of how you're going to reach out to all the variety of communities to ensure that everyone has access. And I think those efforts, therefore, are actually already being made, and so far, to my knowledge, being quite effective.
That's excellent to hear. Everyone deserves that access to these treatments and these breakthroughs. Um, how do you think? I guess this is a similar question, kind of a follow up. How do you think we can improve the accessibility of clinical trials for patients who live very far away from cancer research centers? And you did touch on this a bit on the idea that you can get immunotherapy or patients can participate in many immunotherapy clinical trials right near where they live. But what about people who are very far away? What advice can you give them?
Yeah, it's a little bit tricky for a couple of reasons. We talked a little bit about the commitment to being on a clinical trial earlier. Brian mentioned it yourself, and at the end of the day, they are commitments because there are usually pretty specific and sometimes quite strict stipulations for follow up if you are to remain on that study. And so, if those stipulations aren't met, the patient may be removed from the study for failing to meet those specifications, and it might be number of visits or frequency of imaging or dosing, etc. And so sometimes that can be a challenge if you live far from the institution where the study is being conducted, because it may be a burden on patients to meet the requirements for follow-up imaging, etc. And for those reasons, institutions are aware and are often trying to open up studies in satellites closer to people's homes. And now, of course, particularly in the post-COVID era, there's a bit more acceptance to doing some things virtually as well. And so, what may have had to have been in person visits in the past may now also be simply virtual visits. Or there may be stipulations where drugs that have to be infused rather than a pill. Pills are easier to take closer to home. There may be infusion centers closer to home that can administer that as a satellite of the larger institution as well. So, in the end of the day, the only way to get that answer specifically for yourself is to understand what the requirements are for a trial, what resources are available that you don't have to travel back and forth to the institution to stay on trial. And you'll just have to speak to the treating physician and treating institution to understand which studies might be easier for you if you live at a distance from that institution.
Wow, I mean, telehealth is the silver lining, I suppose, to the horrible COVID pandemic, which we know
Absolutely. Absolutely.
disrupted some clinical research, but now it looks like everyone's getting back on track and everything's moving forward again, which is great to hear. Uh, we have this question. I'm a 4-year cancer survivor, and I'm interested in contributing to clinical research and perhaps trial design. How can I get involved in improving clinical trial design? And are there clinical trials that I can participate in?
Yeah, I think that's great. I'm certainly I'm not an expert in all these areas, but I think obviously CRI has a variety of resources and advocacy groups, and can help pair people in the way that you're discussing. I think certainly there are institutions near you, likely where you can speak with physicians or with clinical trials groups there to learn more about what the opportunities for either volunteering or working even in a paid position alongside a clinical trials group might be. There is a tremendous amount of infrastructure at institutions that goes into conducting clinical trials. Things called clinical research units. There's nursing positions. There's regulatory positions. There's an army of people behind these studies who are either volunteering or being paid for what they do. And I think it's as simple as probably talking to advocacy groups like those of CRI, or talking to institutions and understanding what might be available.
Do hospitals and clinics, do they have services available for members of communities that historically have been underrepresented in clinical trials?
I think many of them do, particularly the larger institutions that have a track record for conducting many clinical trials. Those types of groups will be readily available. There's obviously going to be some variability institution to institution, location to location. But I think if you discuss with the group conducting the trial or with the institution itself, or look online, you'll find exactly those types of groups to exist, again, with some variability across the various places.
Anything to increase that access again is good. Here's a question. If I need to stop immunotherapy on a clinical trial because of a side effect, how likely is it that will be able to restart that trial? I guess that's the question.
Yeah, again, that's going to depend a lot on the stipulations of the study. Some studies will permit pausing for things like that, for toxicities associated with a drug. Some we'll have a threshold past which an endpoint is met where the person can no longer get the drug and is removed from study. It really does depend on the stipulation of that study and what the concerns are. And then if you cannot get the drug on study, again, it returns that other question about, is this a new drug that's not available to the public and therefore difficult to access without the clinical trial? Or is this a drug that they're studying a new use or combination with, such that even if you come off study, you still have access to the drug? And that ultimately turns out to be the most important question there then.
Right. All right. All very good information from Duke University's Dr. Peter Fecci, who's also a Cancer Research Institute Lloyd J. Old star, a scientist taking risks. So it's wonderful to have you here speaking about clinical trials. Before we go, is there anything, any parting advice you would give any patient or caregiver out there right now who's watching this and learning about clinical trials for the first time? What would you say to them?
I think be informed of your options. Oftentimes people will jump on the first clinical trial they find, and just in the rest of life, that's not necessarily the best way to go about it. There's a right trial for you. There's a drug or an experimental therapy that might be best for the type of cancer you have. And the more informed you are, and the more questions you ask, I think the better the fit you're going to find, and the better the chance you'll have of benefiting from that drug if you're informed in the decisions you make. And of course, as always, my biggest advice is just keep fighting.
You heard it, Dr. Fecci. Thank you again so much for joining us and giving this excellent talk on clinical trials, which will be available on demand after our summit. And to all of you watching, thanks for attending. Stick around for more. We have more great sessions as part of the 2022 Cancer Research Institute Virtual Immunotherapy Patient Summit. Thank you.
Thank you.